We are rolling. Today is October 17th, 2018, and today I'm interviewing Eric Reed. My name is Liz Faeder, and this is Eric Reed. And if you go ahead and state your full name and where you're from and when you were born.
Liz, my name is John Eric Reed, and I go by Eric. I was actually born here in Dallas, Texas, at the Baylor Hospital downtown in 1965. I grew up in the Richardson, North Dallas area here in the DFW Metroplex. I have lived in other parts of the United States and some other parts of the world over my life, and I live in Dallas now, and I'm a practicing attorney in the Dallas area.
And when were you born?
I was born in 1965.
Fantastic. If you go ahead and say what your parents' names are as well, and when they were born as well.
My parents are Francis and Jean Ann Reed. My mom was in English in Choctaw in Oklahoma. They were born in 1935 and 1936. Grew up Depression era. My mother in Oklahoma and my father both in the Panhandle of Texas, in Faeder County, and in the Panhandle area in Roger Mills County of Oklahoma. Elk City, I think, is probably the biggest city in that area. And then he came to Dallas in the 50s. They both grew up Depression era, what you'd call the Great Depression era, the Dust Bowl of that era in the United States in the late 1920s through until after World War II.
And your father's name was?
Francis.
And your mother's name?
Jean Ann.
Jean Ann, okay, fantastic. How did your family come to live? They said you were there from Oklahoma, correct?
Yes, my father came down here. His sister, his biological grandfather died when my father was about 15. Mm-hmm. And he worked in a dental laboratory in Elk City for a while, and then came to Dallas because his sister had come down here to Dallas and to begin looking for work 1954, 55, right in that area, that time. My mother came to Dallas because my father's mother was living in Duncan, Oklahoma, and she had gone to the University of Oklahoma with her twin sister and was a school teacher in Duncan, Oklahoma, and there was a relocation program for Native American people in the 1950s. Basically, the government was trying to terminate Indian tribes completely and wanted to assimilate all people into society. So they wanted to move them out of traditional Native American communities and traditional Native American reservations and their reservation land. And they wanted to bring them to metropolises like Oakland, Cleveland, San Francisco, Los Angeles. Dallas was one of those relocation areas. And then sell the land and do away with the Indian tribes completely. And that was part of that program.
How did your parents meet?
They met, my father's mother was a laundress. He ran a laundry in Duncan, and my mother was a school teacher in Duncan. And she had met my mother because she was getting her dresses dry cleaned, that she had to wear as a school teacher. And so she introduced my father to her there in Oklahoma. And he was starting a dental lab here in Dallas and had been drag racing. He also had a dragster shop in Dallas and had gotten drafted into the Army and just gotten out of the Army when he met my mother there in Duncan.
If you could explain maybe about where you grew up around Dallas with your family.
There were kind of three little different areas that we grew up in Dallas, or I grew up in Dallas, my brother and I, my family. The first area was Hamilton Park. Hamilton Park, my mother was relocated and she was a school teacher in Hamilton Park. Hamilton Park in Dallas was a segregated black community at the time. The schools were still segregated. They didn't desegregate until 1975 when she began teaching there. She and my dad had gotten married They had me about a year later, and she continued teaching until my brother was born in 1970, and then did substitute teaching so she could focus on both myself and my brother, raising a family. And they desegregated the schools in 1975. Half of the school in Hamilton Park then went to Forest Meadow and Lake Highlands, and the other half went to Northwood Junior High and Richardson High School. We moved into, when they desegregated, they moved her into teaching at Stoltz Road Elementary, which was not segregated. At the time, it only took white kids, and then when they desegregated, they moved her into that school. We then moved from that area into Farmers Branch for a little while because my father bought a building, fixed the building up, and turned it into the dental laboratory. And then after 3 years in Farmers Branch, we moved into the Hillcrest LBJ area near the Eruv, and then we moved into a predominantly Jewish community. Our home was right by Temple Shalom, which was the Reform synagogue or shul at the time, and probably the furthest north in Dallas at that time.
And how old were you at the time when you moved in that area?
When we moved into right by Temple Shalom, it was about 1977, and so the synagogue, I believe, had been built right about 1973, and I was a kid, so the actual times I don't remember. And so at that time, I didn't even know what being Jewish meant, or other than watching Charlton Heston on TV, for the
yeah, it was a different experience.
Right. Yeah. And so we moved into the community. I knew from being Native American there was discrimination. And I experienced that as a child and through listening to my mother and father. On my father's side, I'm part Southern Cheyenne and all, as well as Comanche, Osage, and Scotch Irish, and Cowboys and Indians got together. And living in the segregated community, my father had hired a black man to run his dental lab, who was a very, very talented dental technician, very artistic and very good. And they moved from Longview, Murray Daniels and Cora Daniels. And so as a result of that, I know a lot of dentists quit his dental lab because he hired a black man to run it. And the Ku Klux Klan came and burned a cross in our yard. I was very young. All I know is I saw a fire. I told my mother about it, and she screamed. She had like a relish tray with some celery and radishes and pimento cheese, and dropped it because people were going to come over. It was like a Sunday evening. And I didn't understand it at that time because I just saw that some men set a fire in the yard, and I said, "Fire, Mama!" And she screamed, and then I know that we were turned away for service when we would go together as families to restaurants here in Dallas, and this was in the late '60s and early '70s. They wouldn't serve us as families together.
This is while you were living around the temple.
At that time, when we were still living in Hamilton Park and over by Stoltz Road Elementary, and then when he hired Murray, I didn't understand, because I was a young kid. I didn't completely understand why the restaurants wouldn't serve us as families. I know as an Indian in Oklahoma, when I would go with my grandfather, they were very secretive about ceremony that he would take me to, special ceremonies, green corn woman, the green corn stomp dance, and other sweat lodge and things. It's a matrilineal society. But as I got older, I understood the reason why they were so secretive about our traditions and our culture. It was a crime in the United States to worship or even speak your own language. And you could be imprisoned in federal prison for up to 2 years.
You guys were the victim of prejudice.
Yes, and that was called a Court of Indian Offenses in Oklahoma, and they could put you in jail for up to 2 years. Now, they did away with that in 1978, although those courts and those laws are still on the books. But as a kid, you don't really know why. If I would speak Choctaw because I learned it from my grandfather, they would say, nish, nish, don't do that, you know, because they didn't want anyone to know that we were Indians in public. And one of the things was I asked my grandmother one time, I said, Grandma, is Granddad and us, are we Indians? And she says, no, we're Black Dutch. I said, what the hell is Black Dutch? I had no idea. So having that, experience coming into the area with the Aruv and the Jewish community, and then learning about Judaism, learning it's not just a religion, it's a culture, it's a life, it's a community, is very similar to being in a Native American tribe. And the women, were, in my opinion, the backbone of the community in many senses. So moving into the community in the 70s, there were a lot of people that immigrated. Our family sponsored women with their children, single mothers from Soviet Union, coming here, in the late 70s with a religious reason that they got out of the Soviet Union and came to the United States. And the synagogue at that point in time, the Reform Synagogue, was more of a community center. It would be more what you viewed as a traditional shul served in communities in Europe during the diaspora. And what a synagogue man in a community, throughout Europe. During the day, the women, they'd have book club. They would talk about health. They would discuss issues. A lot of the old men, most of them looked like they came out of a Mel Brooks casting set. They were curmudgeons and older and very interesting, and they had their hats and coats, and they would talk, with us as kids. And as kids, you just think, wow, that's kind of an interesting old man,
God, I'm sorry.
And so, my mother and the other mothers in the community came together. And the other interesting thing about the 70s was the women's lib movement was also going on. And so women were playing new roles, particularly not in a religious sense, but at least in a family sense. And things were changing. The view of women only being in the home and cooking and doing all of this stuff was changing. And so I remember one of the things, they were very traditional and conservative at the same time. But one of the things the women did was they left us kids with the dads for a week. So that the men would understand this is what we deal with every day. So it was almost a unique way and a realistic way of saying, this is, you men, this is what you have to do too. Yeah. It's a team effort, And so I think that the synagogue, other than a religious side, of course, on Shabbat, played a very important role, not only for the community, but us as kids. Because we would, play games, play basketball, play soccer, come here to JCC, play soccer, play basketball. There was a sense of community there. On shul, what I remember mostly as a kid is that my friends, their families, even if they were Reformed, often they lived really close to the shul. And they would walk. They wouldn't drive to shul, They would walk even though it was a Reform. And I would walk with them and go to shul too, just because they were my friends and I wanted to spend time with them.
Did you go to a religious elementary school or high school?
I didn't go to a religious school. I went to the public Richardson High School, Northwood Junior High.
Okay, fantastic.
Because it was a very mixed community. One of the things that kind of broke the ice with some of the neighbors. The Jewish neighbors, when we moved in the community at first, there's some apprehension or whatever. But one kid was getting picked on at school. I'll leave his name out, by a bully, a redneck bully. And so me being Indian and I guess Irish, and part Irish gypsy too, I got tired of my friend getting picked on, so the kid came. He's much bigger, older than we were. He started picking on him, and I said, come on, you want to get some of it? So we fought, and he whooped me, but I gave him everything I got, and he left that kid alone, and he left me alone. He knew he didn't want to tangle with me. If any of my friends, my buddies, he's going to have to fight me if he wanted to pick on him. The bullying back then, there wasn't a whole lot of intervention by teachers. It was sort of Lord of the Flies.
Yeah.
But when I stood up for that kid, the other reason that I got in a fight at the school is that one of the kids was calling the Jewish kids derogatory names. He was calling the boy a kike. I didn't even know what the word meant. I didn't know it was derogatory. I just knew the way that he was saying it was inappropriate.
Yeah.
And so the one rule my parents had was they didn't want me fighting at school. If I got a fight at school, I was going to get a whooping when I got home. That was sort of the Depression era parenting for it. And so the teacher got involved and said you could either do detention or you can get some blasts, a paddle.
Yeah.
And I wanted to get it over with, so I said, give me the blasts, And he said, well, I got to call your parents. I said, please don't call my parents because I'll get in bigger trouble when I get home. I'm not supposed to fight at school. And so he asked me what happened. And I told him. And he said, you know what, son, I think I'm going to let it slide, but I am going to have to call your parents about the fight. I said, I understand. So we did, and I was scared to death when I got home and told my dad why I fought and the reason. And he said, well, son, I think we'll let this one slide, okay?
Yeah.
I said, but I don't want you fighting at school either, All right, Dad, And so after that, the community, the families, they knew that I would stand up for my friends, and right next to us was the Ginsburgs, Carl and Jacob Ginsburgs, Major Ginsburg, their father, Scarlett Ginsburg. Their father, they had actually grown up in Paris, Texas. Mm-hmm. So during the 40s, when he was a kid, they had to drive to Dallas to Ferret, to go to shul, from Bonham, Paris, and Nakona, Texas. Mm-hmm. And they lived in Dallas. And so the Schoenbruns, the Zlotskys, the Katz, the Thalls, Dr. Thal was one of the doctors that attended to John F. Kennedy when Kennedy was shot. And so there was no apprehension. Yeah. And so those families had me involved in their lives as well. And so I learned from their mothers and the fathers and the kids about respect, And then I think that helped me understand what it was like to be Jewish, except not being Jewish. So,
do you think your father and your mother's their background in regards to everything was going on at that time, and the reason they wanted to sponsor Russian Jews, do you think that's because of just they didn't want to see a repeat of history, so to speak, with that? Because like you said, there's a lot of prejudice going on at that time.
Well, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, if you look at World War II and the horrifying stuff that occurred in World War II, Stalin, who isn't really discussed, did as much or worse to Jewish farmers and peasants in Russia. And at that time in the 70s, you had the Cold War, and everybody was horrified at what Jewish people, or even anyone with a religious belief in that country might be experiencing, but in particular the Jewish people. And so my father knew that they were coming here completely disadvantaged. Most of them could barely speak English, let alone, have a job or anything else. So that's why Jewish Family Services was there, and we got involved. And one of the first ladies we sponsored She came with her son. No, I don't understand why, but there were issues with alcoholism and much like a reservation, marginalization. Mm-hmm. And so she came, all of her belongings smashed up. Mm-hmm. The Russian soldiers smashed everything, what little heirlooms she was allowed to bring. And so Mira, to this day, she's our family. Mira Kavinsky, yeah. And she is, and her son Igor is our family. Mm-hmm. And so they grew up going to shul. He went to Richardson as well. And I'll tell you one thing that's the funnest thing I've ever done is if you've ever been to a Russian Jewish wedding, oh my God, the food, the courses of food, 12 course, and it's not really a good Russian Jewish wedding until there's at least one fight, okay? I mean, and the old man has to break it up. Yeah. But the things I remember most with sponsoring those families was learning diversity. Not just Judaism, but the Russian component of how it played into Jewish religious belief and culture, and the traditions that they brought down. I tell my friends I learned as much Yiddish as I did Choctaw because the old men would speak the Yiddish, or the women, the old widow women. And so as Shabbat boys, we would go and check on these widow women, make lists, turn on the lights. It was community service. Yes, there was a religious component, but at the same time, it was checking on elders in our community.
You were a part of the Shabbat boys?
Yeah, yes. Brad Wepburn, myself, Benny Schombrun, the Ginsberg brothers.
And how old were you?
Oh, God, 13.
Yeah.
I was also in Boy Scouts.
And this is why you were
a lot of those guys were doing it because it was part of the community service for their bar mitzvahs.
Yes.
And I did it because they were my friends, and the synagogue needed extra people to go out and check on these folks in the community.
So do you still keep in touch with these friends?
I do. One of my best friends, Brad Wepburn, he's a doctor here in Dallas. He was one of the guys on the team that separated the Egyptian twins. He's a pediatric neurosurgeon. Wow. He got picked on in high school. And he said, "Why are they picking?" I said, "Brad, don't worry about it. When you're a brain surgeon and they're selling shoes at the mall, it's not going to mean anything." Well, not only is he a brain surgeon, my God, he was so brilliant. He's a pediatric brain surgeon,
You went to elementary school, then Richardson High School, and then college. Where did you go to school? Where did you go to school college-wise?
I went to SMU.
SMU.
Yes.
Why did you decide to pursue a career in law?
That's an interesting thing. After SMU, there weren't any jobs. I went in the military briefly, or not briefly, but for a while.
Yeah.
And because there weren't any jobs as an officer, Marine. Just saw many things, a lot of disparity. Also, my roots as a Native, and unfortunately, if you're Native American, we're still under assault by the government. I mean, right now, the Indian Child Welfare Act, it's a $6 billion industry in trafficking in Native children. They're looking at trying to terminate our tribes again. They're sending out notices saying federal government's no longer going to enroll any of our newborn children as natives to have the treaty right benefits that the government owes the tribe and the indigenous peoples.
When did you graduate from, I'm sorry?
1988
from SMU.
From SMU.
Okay, and how many years were you in that school?
I was there 4. I got an economics finance degree, and an anthropology degree, and a business minor.
And this was SMU was before or after you in the Army for a bit?
I was before that. I went to school and then went to officer candidate school and then went in the Marines.
And why did you want to try and pursue that after you graduated SMU?
Because there were no jobs.
Yeah,
the real estate market crashed. The financial banks were failing. And I had a finance degree. They were letting people go that had MBAs, and not just bachelor degrees.
Yeah. And
so after the military, I saw a lot of horrifying human rights problems, and being Native, got involved by going to law school because I saw the struggles that my grandfather had with the Bureau of Indian Affairs and just the marginalization. And that also was part of the reason that I think I understood more about the relationship that I had with the Jewish community and being part of the community, because it was a very shared cultural experience of marginalization around the world, indigenous people around the world. And we're still having to deal with those issues even today, in our own country that professes to be, human rights oriented.
So you think I think it kind of comes full circle.
It does, and that is why the circle is the representation of what we as natives believe.
Yeah.
The circle never stops and it never ends. It always is there.
Because it's like your parents helped people. You saw how that impacted you. Then you helped people in school. You defended them.
Yes.
And it just comes full circle. Do you think that's, how do
And
you feel about
I
that?
don't know. I think what I learned as a child is you stand up for people, even if it means that you might lose out. You stand up to do the right thing. If you see somebody being picked on, you stand up and do the right thing, and always be in a position where you do what is right rather than what is convenient.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense?
Oh, absolutely.
And it's, I think, a cultural thing to show at least natives in the matrilineal way, to show compassion to others always, and help be if you've got something extra, you share that. And that's something in the community. As a kid, those women would check, if there was an older family or like one of these Russian immigrants, they didn't have enough to eat, we took food, and when they had more, they would cook up a pot of borscht, the soup, and bring it to the house, even though, we didn't need the food. But that's another thing. Even if you don't need it, you show that family respect and you take the food and enjoy the food. Said some of the most interesting moments was spent, at the synagogue, running around, seeing the women talk or cook or do that, watching them play cards or talk about issues, Yeah. That was kind of fascinating for us, even though we were bored, we knew our mothers were up doing something, they were involved. And the fathers were always there to support us and give us advice, I don't think I ever saw any, at least of our generation, disrespect their wives, the men. And that was just something else that I thought was interesting. The one thing that I think that I kind of am disappointed that I don't see anymore in the shul, because the demographics have changed, is that involvement involving kids, where there was a sense of community, where they were reaching out to the community. I don't know if it's the times, I don't know if it's technology, we didn't have certain, but it doesn't seem, people don't seem as engaged together as they were then. Yeah. And I'm not saying it's some utopian thing. There were problems and issues and but I just, like being a Shabbat boy, that was fun. One of the things that I had to do as a Shabbat boy was go with the kosher Rabbi Jacobson, Interestingly enough, guess who his best friend was? The imam of the mosque. Because halal and kosher are under the Old Testament. Yeah. So the two of them would go and they would drink this god-awful coffee, like a Turkish coffee. You might as well take a shot of schnapps, or it would, they would drink the coffee and they would visit in a mixture of Hebrew and Arabic. Yeah. Okay, the language. And so then they would go and the man would bring the meat. And they would go look at the meat. And the two of them would always, they would say, yes, it looked right. It looked right. Every time, it looked right. Mm-hmm. Then the one time was, the two of them did their ritual, and they looked at the meat, and both of them looked as though they had seen a monster or something, because they both jumped back and were both shaking their head no. And they knew immediately when they saw the cut that it was wrong. And so, that was sort of an odd thing and an experience, but it's also kind of cultural. It's also religious. And that, to me, was very fascinating as a young kid. And so they had to take the meat out and bring some back, bring another back, and they inspected it and went from there. But that was something kind of interesting, but it was the rabbi and the imam. Yeah. And so probably the most profound moment in junior high in that period of time was there was some anti-Semitism at the school. I was having to fight to protect my friends.
You went to?
Northwood Junior High.
Okay, what year was this?
77, 78, 79. And this was public school. Mm-hmm. It was different then. Assessment tests were used to find out where a kid needed to be in the schooling process, not to try and force them to pass a test to say that they're literate. Mm-hmm. They actually learned, and if the assessment test said they needed something extra, they went into a class to get remedial math or English or lit, so that they would be able to function, not simply pass a test and say, oh, you've met these minimum requirements. Yeah. No. When there was an issue at that school, they brought in Rabbi Jacobson. What is remarkable about that is that he had the hat that he wore in Auschwitz. What is remarkable about that is that he showed us a bar of soap that was made from other human beings. What was remarkable about that was how humble that man was. What was remarkable about that is what one human being would do to another human being just because of their religious belief and culture. And the most profound moment was when he turned up his sleeve and showed us the number tattooed on his arm.
You said there was an incident of anti-Semitism at that school. Do you remember what exactly happened?
I think it was epithets, using names, derogatory names toward Jewish people, as well as Africans, because the African American community coming from Hamilton Park. Mm-hmm. But I think more profound was I think the fight that I had when they were picking on the Jewish kid, mm-hmm. and they were targeting the kid because he was Jewish. Mm-hmm. And the school, Principal George Daly, he's still a friend of mine, he's still alive, mm-hmm. had the acumen to know how to deal with that. He didn't put people in detentions and throw them in, alternative schools. No, he engaged people together, even those that were saying bad things, it comes from fear, ignorance, and that fear and that ignorance coupled together gets bigotry. Mm-hmm. What he was trying to do is show that there's other things. And so a lot of kids became very engaged, and I'm not going to say it ended, because some people are racist no matter what you do, but it brought awareness. Mm-hmm. And it brought an interest in understanding more about World War II, and understanding more about how not even the world, but a lot of people turned their backs on Jewish people and Slavic people and gypsies and anyone else that were marginalized by the Nazis at that period of time.
Minorities, yeah.
Any minority, yes. Because that burned into my mind that we can't ever let this happen again, not only as a Native American, mm-hmm. and as the stories I learned as a child as a Native American, and seeing how the government treats us even today, that burned into my memory two different ways. One, that's horrifying that something like that could happen in the world, no matter what era we're in. But it also reminded me that that's where I've come from. That's where my ancestors came from, fighting. And I'm a mix of cultures, and that's a beautiful thing too. It's good, bad. So you have to temper it, and that we're still fighting that fight. Now, they're not, wholesale killing us, but at the same time they want to take our land away. Native women are the most missing and murdered in metropolises around the United States per capita. Children, Native children are still trafficked in adoptions that have less than stellar protections. And the Indian Child Welfare Act, while it was a law to protect against that, is trying to be done away with.
You have your own law firm and things like that. Do you try these issues that are going on right now with Native American women and what you just quoted? Do you try and tackle these issues? Have you?
Oh yes, yeah. I have an expertise.
If you don't mind, if you can, if you're allowed to, can you expand on that a little bit?
One is advocacy. Trying to talk with others about these issues and that they still are important. They're not just important for natives; they're important for other minorities in this area and in the United States. For example, a Jewish family comes to me. They say, "Eric, can you help us? The rabbi sent us to you. The goyim." And he said, "Trust this goyim." And I said, "Okay." So I talked with them. I found out what the deal is. Kid goes over on an overnight sleep with his buddies. They live in Plano, okay? And they have that giant church, shopping mall for Christ, I call it, up in Plano. Kid goes over for a sleepover, slumber party where they lock him in a gym and eat a pizza and play games. The youth minister baptizes the boy and has him renounce Judaism. This is a 12, 13-year-old kid in the process of trying to get a bar mitzvah. You have to also understand kids. This is also kids in that preteen years where he wants to be defiant towards his parents and, try to stand up for himself. He acts a little defiant. Well, what are you going to do about it, Mom? Kind of a smart alecky response. They come to me. They're horrified. I say, I know how to deal with this. I told the kid, you're nothing now. Okay? Your community is only as strong as you are. That's what I learned growing up in a Jewish community. They're depending on you to be a part of this community. Do you even know what it meant to get baptized? Well, no. So I send a letter to the church. I said, you're going to apologize. You're going to take care of this family, and you're going to donate $1,000 to the Holocaust Museum because this is completely inappropriate. I finally talked to the kid, and I had to do a little bit of shaming with the kid because the kid was kind of in that sort of preteen defiant. So I had to let the kid understand what it meant, not just to his mother and father, but how he let the whole community down. Because other kids in the community are depending on him to become a man. And becoming a man through bar mitzvah is learning about your faith, your culture, and then being a part of it. The kid started crying. And then that's when we got the rabbi back involved and went forward with the proper thing. But in 2000, and this is in like 2013, in 2013, why am I having to go through this with this family and a child when I went and spent the night at the shul? I went and spent the night with their families, and not once did they convert me or even, I learned. I did Passovers, Shabbat dinners, other celebrations, and they would come and stay with my family and vice versa. So that is one of the reasons that I got engaged as a lawyer. And yes, I make money doing business law as well, advising companies. Yeah. I also work with tribes trying to do sustainable development and low-cost energy, green and renewable, like solar, wind, in marginalized communities and rural communities where they're not getting, they don't have access to the resources, and so that they can have and maintain local economies.
Wow. Could you we're gonna go back to this in a second, but could you just tell me a little bit about your family life? Do you have a wife and children?
Yeah.
Where did you meet her? What's her name?
I met my wife, Teresa, at the University of Iowa Law School.
Okay.
And she is from Iowa.
And this is the law school you went to?
Yeah, the University of Iowa Law School.
Okay.
After I got a scholarship. Actually, before that, I applied because I wanted to see about law school. I wasn't completely sure. So I applied for this thing called a Pre-Law Summer Institute for American Indians at the American Indian Law Center, run by a fellow by the name of Sam DeLauria. His brother is a renowned writer, Vine DeLauria, and an educator. Sam is the same. Vine is passed and Sam is retired. But the American Indian Law Center has been around since 1968. And it was because the Indian native people now only represent 1% of the entire population. And a percent of 1% of the legal community. They want, and most of the educational experiences that native kids have is not in the top-notch schools, and they're not lucky enough to have a mother who's a school teacher that enforces that just as Jewish families, and education is more valuable than a boat or a condominium. You know, those things are really, those can vanish, and they're material things. They're not of substance like an education. And so that school was to prepare native students to go to law school. It was like doing a pre-semester just to prepare you, so when you got to a law school that you would be able to understand how to brief a case and be on almost the same level as some of the other students entering the law school, just to prepare you for that, and to make sure that's really what you want to do, you know, as a career. So I did that, and then I went to Iowa. Several years in, I worked with, I was a fellow for Professor Robert N. Clinton, who is a renowned Native American law expert, who's Jewish as well. And he had the same inclinations towards Native people based on his own experiences growing up in Cleveland as a Jewish kid in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, you know. And so the other professor I worked with, Professor S. James Jim Anaya, and he's now the dean of the Colorado Law School, and he was UN Special Rapporteur to indigenous people. So I got involved with them, and that's how I got interested in the international indigenous rights as well as federal domestic Indian law. And that's why I chose Iowa, because both of those professors were there, and they were very top-notch, and I wanted to learn about the human rights law as well as how it relates to Native people. Then I met my wife, Teresa, and she came to Dallas kicking and screaming. You know, she was an Iowa girl, so she was corn-fed and hand-spanked, and I enjoyed meeting her in Iowa. And her father and mother are educators too. So school and education were a primary important thing in their family life as well.
When did you all get married?
We got married in 1996 in her hometown church, a Catholic, she was Catholic, Catholic church in Ames, Iowa, at Iowa State, where her father was a professor and her mother a school teacher. And they were large family, 9 kids. And so the main thing in their lives was learning how to get an education, not, you know, material things.
Yeah.
And so she was more interested, we're both feminists too. Yeah. And so she was more interested in kind of staying in an area other than Dallas.
Yeah.
You know, Dallas is an interesting area for people that aren't from Dallas. And she came here because I got a job at the district attorney's office in the organized crime division. And so I came from the reservation, the Cheyenne River, where I'd been a tribal attorney for 3 years. Came down here, took that position. We ended up staying. We have 2 children, Jack and Helen, a little boy and a little girl. And our children, again, our interest is not what most expensive thing we can own in life, but we have both of our children at Green Hill School.
Great.
And they're in the middle school there. The interesting thing about it is most people think Green Hill School is a Jewish school because a lot of Jewish kids go to school. Again, I say, no, it's not a Jewish school. It is a school where the focus of the attention is on a diverse and creative thought education as well as logical thought. And again, Jewish families value an education rather than most material things, although there are some very wealthy families that send their kids to school there too. But by and large, I would say most of the families, whether they're Jewish or non-Jewish, focus on the educational opportunity that the kids get. Kids, I am involved with the Boy Scout troop and the Girl Scout troop. One of my closest friends at the school is, and we're completely politically divergent, is the David Bach and Robin Bach, the Bach family from Faeder, Israel. My Boy Scout troop, because some of the synagogues had dropped Boy Scout programs at the time, there was some discrimination. When I started our Cub Scout group, as well as that's gone away, there's no discrimination now. But even during the discrimination, I made it very clear that no parent was going to be discriminated against in our group for any reason whatsoever. And Green Hill allowed us to continue that. We formed a Jewish and Christian troop. The kids get to interact with both. They ask questions. We volunteer at the kosher chili cook-off, as well as other community service that the shul might need, or any shul for Boy Scouts or whatever that we can do to help out the Jewish community. I've made it a point that all of my boys get to see and understand how a Jewish service is conducted. We've even been to the Orthodox one that was conducted. We went through the whole book of Exodus in Hebrew, and I never expected to do that in my life. But the kids enjoyed it. They thought it was different. They got to interact with the elders, and talk with them and understand, the shawl and the why you pray a certain way. And I have encouraged all of the Jewish kids in my troop to engage with the rabbi and suffered. Never forget that they did survive, and that what you can learn from them is invaluable, is a treasure. So young people, talk with your elders. Talk to the curmudgeon wearing the hat and the cane. It's not so wonderful to be around. It may not smell great. Spend some time talking to the old guy, because you'll learn a lot. You'll learn a lot. Don't despair. Talk to them. They'll talk to you. And once you get their trust, then you'll really get the good information. And you might even get a trip down to Wall's Cafeteria or Wall's Catering on Royal and get some good kugel or something of that nature. That was the other thing. When the old guys, when you got to know the old guys that sat around and even if they complained, there was something to learn. And when you were a mensch in their eyes, or you did a mitzvah for them, they would take you out to lunch. And so there's good and there's bad, but be strong. That's really the key. Don't be afraid. Don't let them create fear in you and destroy the hope that you have to change things.
Thank you so much. I
Absolutely.
Really appreciate it.
I'm glad I got to spend time.
I am too. I have one last question.
Sure. Absolutely.
Can you explain your necklace?
Yes. This is what you call a tribal medallion.
Here, you know what? I'm gonna cut really quick. And we'll just do like an up close thing. Here. So just go ahead and I'm recording here now. So go ahead and explain this piece of jewelry for us.
A tribal medallion is a medallion that generally represents somebody's tribe. It can be a number of different things. This one is for the Choctaw Nation, made by a lady named Jennifer Davis, who's a nurse and she does beadwork. What you call traditional items that natives wear is called regalia, or even referred to sometimes as an outfit. And the beadwork is done in the traditional way. And this has got a Choctaw emblem in it, which is to designate that my mother, our matrilineal society, that I'm enrolled as a Choctaw. I'm also, I'm named after Eric, Oklahoma, on the Black Kettle Indian Reservation of the Southern Cheyenne, and Eric, Oklahoma. And there are Plains Indians. They were the people that were shot down and killed, massacred at Sand Creek. Chief Black Kettle was among them. And this was made for me you can wear to a traditional event or a powwow. Kind of like wearing a yarmulke on Saturday, except when you go, it just designates what tribe you're in. And I'm in a Choctaw tribe. One of the other brooches that was made for me is this one. It's got the directions of the 4 directions: the white, black, red, and yellow. The white represents the north, also part of the white buffalo calf maiden angel story. The black represents the south, where dark and warm rain come. The yellow is where the east, where the sun rises, and the red is the west, where the sun sets. There are also a variation on the circle in the 4 directions. This one is a plains. It also has those Lakota 4 directions colors. The star is part of the Comanche part of the family, because Chief Quatta Parker had Star House in Cache, Oklahoma, which is a historic house, and it should be on the National Historic Register rather than privately owned and rotting. And Star House, that was his representation. He also founded the Native American Church, which is a religious organization in the United States, is a native-based Christian organization, but the star is from his Star House. And so a lady made this for me when we rescued a white buffalo here in Dallas from a liquor store in downtown, and she was preserved and taken to the Fort Worth Nature Center to live with the buffalo herd there, and I'm honored to have it and wear it often when I'm involved in something of that nature.
Thank you so much.